Social democracy proper begins with ego death. Self exists only and entirely as an effect of the infinitely complex set of ever shifting relations which constitutes it, and under current historical circumstances. Ego suicide can be executed in multiple ways, such as down the path of Sangha, or via taking acid's long, strange trip. Yet, in order for ego death to be reached, one's egoism must die first, a necessary egoism death. However, we have found ourselves deeper into the pits of egoism, which we need to dig ourselves out of before reaching ego death. The mandatory individualism imposed by neoliberalism was a new form of individualism, an individualism defined against the different forms of collectivity that clamored out of the 60s. One is unlikely to find oneself ego dead after one trip. It takes most successive trips to reach ego death. It is advisable to work your way up to a higher dose and not just jump into the one big trip from nothing. One is unlikely to alter their utter individualism after a singular trip at any level. It takes time, patience, practice, and understanding to interconnect with the wider world. By individualism, I mean not just casual selfishness, but rather a whole ideology and worldview which assumes experience to be fundamentally individual in nature, private before it is public, personal before it is social. It is always on some level the effects of individualism which consciousness raising seeks to overcome. Acid social democracy seeks to raise people out of egoism into collective social consciousness and mass social action. Social democracy agrees with the notion that there is in fact a deeper, more profound enlightenment to be found in a state of intoxication. The state of intoxication itself is not necessary to be an acid social democrat, but it doesn't hurt. Instead, acid and psychotropic drugs, along with the movements they inspired in the 60s, are meant to inspire a new radical form of social democracy. Traditionally, the social democratic tradition can be regarded as a conservative project. The class compromise of social democracy tamed and tames the more radical impetus towards class conflict. In this sense, at least, it is fair to say that social democracy saved capitalism. Social democracy must move beyond its conservatism to become a true leftist ideology. Social democracy is only progressive in a particular social context, not inherently so. Our situation should not be one where we simply return to social democracy as practiced under the New Deal, but expand social democracy beyond past convictions and projects. In a near Trotskyist sense, social democracy could undertake a project of permanent reform. This state of permanent reform would be a cosmopolitan project that enacts ever new socially beneficial reforms at both the global and local levels. Social democracy is a quite sober and rational political philosophy. Yet, social democracy needs to look beyond politics into altered states and alternative forms of music, seeking to be a consciousness-raising movement. we can resurrect the spirit of the 1960s and 1970s while guiding this spirit through new material conditions, not be led by the past, but to lead the past into the future. Instead of looking at the movements of the 1960s and 1970s as a lost past, we could ask ourselves, what if the counterculture was only a stumbling beginning rather than the best that could be hoped for? As is the case with acid communism, acid social democracy is a project beyond the pleasure principle. It is not only a project for the recuperation of the counterculture's lost potentials, but also the expression of a desire for an experimental rather than prescriptively utopian leftist politics. We may think we have a full understanding of the manners and capabilities of social democracy, but the new and previously unknown might be found in the politics we mistakenly think we already know, reinstating a politics to come. Social democracy will not make use of all the tools available to enact change, but it holds the ability to change and raise the consciousness of singular people and the whole society, be that through the creative use of psychedelic chemicals, aesthetic experiments in music and other arts. Just because Woodstock 99 failed does not mean that free love and hippies should be placed in caskets. Instead, the failure of Woodstock 99 is that the hippies sold out long before the event, and the spirit of Woodstock was infected with the specter of laissez-faire capitalism. What acid social democracy seeks is to create a rejection of both traditional hierarchies and of any simple individualism. It realizes there is a need for forms of social practice and institutional culture which can replicate some of the traditional roles of the Sangha for practitioners while maintaining a sense of explicit critical and political vocation in their organized groups, and solidarity with progressive political forces and explicit hostility to regressive ones. While these forms will be built off a capitalist framework initially, they will be so altered that they will be unrecognizable from their deep ancestor. Imagine if the ship of Theseus looked nothing like the original ship. Now think about how acid can radically alter one's mind while keeping them in the same body. Acid social democracy works from the shell of capitalism, but alters capitalism's consciousness so deeply that an entirely new set of systems of regulations can emerge and an entirely new system of relations can emerge. Yet, these systems will be built from the hull of capitalism, and the world owes a debt to capitalism. But we should not assume we have a perfect economic model or return to laissez-faire capitalism. All of this is not to deny the fantastic achievements of social democracy during the period from the American New Deal to the foundation of the National Health Service in the UK. Instead, because social democracy has been so successful under many metrics, it can be a political tool toward even greater change. The issue is not that social democracy has had no success. It is that social democracy could have even more success. Possibly the main issue social democratic movements have is that they allow themselves to lose momentum rather than keep up constant pressure. While the hippies themselves turned their backs on society in the course of the 1970s. Socialism in one person, as filmmaker Adam Curtis once wappishly called it. Left politics turned into third way social democracy, which meant a shaking of ideological feathers and a capitulation to a neoliberal worldview. Here, we need a fourth way, a fifth way, a sixth way, and so on of social democracy. What is needed is a form of social democracy that does not undo but keeps its prior reforms by establishing frameworks that reward active, positive social changes. Social democracy should not just be happy with winning a few reforms, but act as psychonauts do, as explorers of ever new altered states. Like acid communism, acid social democracy presumes the importance of thought and assumes that raised consciousness will mean class consciousness. But there are dangers to staring too long in the mirror on LSD, and there may be dangers to mass enlightenment. But one must accept the possibility of a bad trip every time they take a powerful psychotropic drug. And when it comes to working through a bad trip, the only way out is through. The feeling of intoxication, while often being quite enjoyable, is not the main goal of a trip, but instead what you get out of a trip. For Benjamin, intoxication was never an end in itself. Rather, what interested him was experience. Indeed, his entire philosophy can be seen, much like Kant's for that matter, as a theory of the conditions of existence. Acid social democracy is certainly not just about doing drugs. Tech bros took drugs and they did tantric sex and Buddhism and all the rest of it. But they weren't pro-trade unions, they weren't anti-imperialist, and they certainly weren't anti-capitalist. What do we do after our many trips? Who do we come back as after our many trips? Should we not travel back with a few fixed up relics? Historically, social democracy reflected a left-right consciousness. The Christian Democrats who governed France, Germany, and Italy had economic policies very similar to those of the Social Democrats who governed Sweden and Denmark. Both built robust welfare states and empowered unions in the post-war years. But the goal is to move beyond history. Too often, Social Democrats look to remodel the successes of the past. However, could we not bring back to life a failed past movement, giving it this potential new life, being grateful to be dead? We have forgotten how to shape the future. The future can never be entirely fresh, as it is essentially built off the past. But are we not offering new visions from the past, only sticking with a limited range of outlooks? For example, our expectations of technology are born out of Cold War spin. We've been fed orchestrated fantasies about the future to distract us from the present. We are overly caught up in the realm of past futures as opposed to past present futures. But through acid, we can more clearly see the interconnectedness of all times. Acid social democracy points out that injustice has occurred, is occurring, and will occur unless we make the needed ongoing reforms. Acid shakes one from the mentality that we are born alone and die alone. We know that we are all products of social relations, that nobody comes into the world alone, that we are dependent upon a vast network of social relations to meet every one of our material needs. But we forget this fact that it is right before us. We have short memories when distracted by glitz, spectacle, and razamats and futuristic utopias. We are sold an individualistic utopia, but this view is easily destroyed with a single tab, whereas collective betterment is simply found in the universalization of the trip. Capitalism is a synthetic trip. Benjamin's problem with the surrealist dream, as well as with synthetic intoxication, is that it remains thoroughly through individual experience. To trip is to trip with others. We do not travel life's journey alone. Acid social democracy takes on the idea of psychedelia, of changing your perspective on the world and looking at things in a new way. Acid social democracy is extremely open to experimentation, to political thoughts, to political modes, to ways of being, and art inspired by the work of Miles Davis, Jimi Hendrix, Siamade, Herbie Hancock, Santana, Alice Coltrane, Parliament, Funkadelic, etc., and the emergence of an Afro-psychedelic, etc., which persists today in the work of deep house producers such as Joe Colossal. All of this music is notable for the ways in which it uses improvisation, experimental studio recording, and a range of other sonic effects to produce work which sounds at the same time incredibly free and incredibly collective. Acid social democracy is an experimental, open house, collective movement. Drop in and drop out. There's a need for social democracy beyond rationale. Art, music, and literature circumvent logic. They are methods and vessels for messages, feelings, and desires that interact with logic, but target another major thing: emotion. Art, music, and literature aren't just media to consume, but the tools and vessels to share emotion combined with logic. Acid social democracy seeks to create a society that is truly enjoyable. Instead of seeking to overcome capital, we should focus on what capital must always obstruct: the collective capacity to produce, care, and enjoy. Acid can bring a sense of joy, a joy that we should experiment with and run with. Joy is not a singular mode, but a common foundation which allows the collective their individual possibilities of happiness. In this sense, joy is a techne and a selfless technology. And could such technologies of non-self be put to work in the service of radical politics? Acid is also a technology that drives people toward collectivism. Social democracy is a technology that could drive people toward joy and collectivism. Why not overdrive social democracy with acid, making social democracy even more capable of joy and collectivism? We must see social democracy as a means to exit our limited self stations and interconnect with the wider universe. Class renegades such as Pink Floyd, young people from bourgeoisie families who had rejected their own class destinies and identified downwards or outwards. And the stereotype of hippies was based on the stereotype of the beatnik, which was a stereotype rooted in black culture. Acid social democracy will allow us to move beyond the modes we were born into, one or more reforms at a time. Acid social democracy takes the spirit of self-alteration via drugs and extrapolates it to wider society. We cannot have the idea of a world beyond capital because it is dispatched into a utopian beyond. Instead, we should go about acidifying reality, breaking down the notions of what we deem normal and abnormal. The psychedelic movement combined with the social change and upheaval to create a massive cultural shift from the suits and suburbs of the 1950s white America into the vision of the hippies and radicals we all imagined, and it suddenly vanished. Yet we still hold on to the relics of those movements from the 1960s and 70s. The history is not lost, so these seemingly vanished movements only lie dormant. The revolutionary demands of the 1970s that once seemed so inevitably close to manifestation never came to be, but they can be later realized. While the 60s and even the 70s have come to seem at once like a deep past so exotic and distant that we cannot imagine living in it, there is nothing truly exotic about them if we assume that it is an impossible potential past. However apparent that the 60s counterculture is now inseparable from its own simulation, and the reduction of the decade to iconic images, to classic music, and to nostalgia reminiscences has neutralized the real promises that exploded then. These images and music can be used as building blocks toward new futures. Dismissing reformism ignores real pains occurring in the here and now. Dismissing reformism ignores real pains occurring in the here and now. We can and must step over homeless people because giving to charity only obstructs the coming revolution. But perhaps one does not need to wait to spawn revolution amid permanent reform. That we should both give to the homeless individual now and help them now, but also spur on systems that implement real change. That permanent reform could yield the same, if not a better result than revolution could in the long run. If the very fundamentals of our experience, such as our sense of space and time, can be altered, does that not mean that the categories by which we live are plastic, mutable? And to only limit the categories by which we live individually, but also collectively. In this sense, one should learn to be a ripple in still water, when there is no pebble tossed, nor wind to blow.